You could still sell a business that is loss-making, but you're not going to maximize the potential for the seller. They've disrupted their sector.
Today's guest, Steve Drake, with 30 years experience in buying, selling, doing IPOs for businesses after working for one of the big four auditing firms. He really is an expert in understanding what you do, how you do it, and how you can take your business and sell it if you want to, or change it, build it, grow it, consolidate it, all depending on your needs.
Typically, in most scenarios, the owners will stay in the business for a period of time. If they are wanting to exit immediately, that's a bit of a red flag. There's no one answer to governance. It's ultimately about how well is an organization run, but run for who?
Please welcome Steve Drake. This episode is proudly sponsored by Allsop & Allsop, Dubai's leading and largest real estate brokerage. They've been in business for 16 years, and they have created 153 millionaires within their organisation. The top earners in the company are taking in over 10 million dirhams in commission annually. Now, has that got your attention? Because it gets better. If you're considering a change in career or you're looking for your next step, there literally is only one choice. Life at Allsop & Allsop offers unlimited tax-free earning potential and an unmatched high-performance culture that you'll find in no other brokerage here in the UAE. They're there because they're designed to unlock your full potential. Be trained by the best to become the best. You'll be working with a hand-picked team of real estate experts who really are the best the industry has to offer. There's no wonder they have the strongest retention in the industry. Are you ready to change your life? Get in touch with Allsop & Allsop. Keep moving. Steve, thanks for coming to join us on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
So MEAP, your business, I want to learn all about that. I want to find out a bit about you so that I can really try and understand your experience and the wisdom that you bring to it. But I think the first question I've got for you is, what does MEAP do and why should we listen?
So MEAP is Middle East Advisory Partners. We started a few years ago, and ultimately we are there to help clients do things that ordinarily they can't do themselves.
Okay, so give me an example of one or two of those things.
So most of the clients we work with are owner managers. They're very good at what they do, whatever their business is. When it comes to change of some sort, that's where they haven't necessarily got the experience and look to support. So a good example of that, which is quite topical at the moment, is people looking to sell their businesses. They haven't been through the process. They don't know how to maximize value. They don't necessarily know who to sell to. So having somebody who can help answer those questions is an example of what we do.
So if I had a business that I was selling, I could come to you, you could help me understand the process that I need to follow, but can you help me sell my business for me?
Yes.
Okay, so you sell businesses?
We do.
Okay, so there'll be a lot of people out there that might be business owners, entrepreneurs, people that have built a business to a certain level and be looking to maybe retire, get out and stuff like that.
Yep.
I've seen over the years that there's always been a challenge with people that go into retirement. They're older, they've got a small business, but they hope that their kids might inherit it and take it over, but that isn't necessarily what they want to do, and they sometimes just run them and close them down, and
exactly.
Nothing else happens, rather than extracting value.
Exactly.
Is that something you see?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably say less so here. People are savvy to saying, let's get the value out of this as opposed to closing it. Perhaps in the UK, that's more common, but certainly not here.
So let's learn about this then. So let's say I'm planning to sell my business.
Mm-hmm.
What should I be looking into? What should I be studying? What should I be trying to understand? What would you teach me?
So I suppose starting point is like anything else. If you're selling a house, you're selling a car, selling something that has value to you, you try to make it look as good as it can to get the best value. So it's the same principle with a business. So for us, starting point is there anything within our business that could be an inhibitor? Anything that might defer a transaction, delay a transaction, or something that might be an impact on the purchase price. So buyer might say, I don't like this aspect, so I'm going to reduce the purchase price for that. So having a preparation period where you look into the business, understand what roadblocks there might be or any inhibitors, dealing with those so that you can have a smooth sales process. That's where you'd start.
Okay, so what kind of things would be inhibitors in general? Give me some ideas around that.
Profitability is an obvious starting point. It might not surprise you that people come to us and say, can you help us sell our business? But we've been loss-making for the last few years. That doesn't mean it's impossible to sell the business, but not being profitable is a tough starting point. So looking at, well, why are you not profitable? Is it, dynamics of the business? Is it the way that you've run it? Is it you haven't managed costs? What is that? So that we can try and perhaps deal with those things before we enter into a sales transaction. So clean the house, as it were. And profitability is a good example of that. It could be that it isn't easy to buy. Examples of that might be you're across multiple geographies, you've got companies in different jurisdictions, they're subject to different rules and regulations, you don't necessarily have an easily investable structure together. So there's a bit of time and effort to, again, clean the house, put a good structure, make it easier for an investor to invest into or a buyer to purchase. Those types of things.
I kind of think when I think about it like a car, it's like make sure you get the T-cut on the chrome bumpers and make sure they shine, make sure you get rid of the dents, make sure the engine is running and sounding well and it's been serviced, make sure the inside of the car doesn't smell, make sure the tyres are in good condition, and make sure you just can present it the best way you possibly can, and go and look at every aspect of that car with a fine-tooth comb and be judgmental yourself. And so that you can really make sure that it's in its best possible condition.
That's a good analogy. What I would add to that is, and it's also had one good, careful owner.
One good, careful owner. Okay, not often with cars do you find that, yeah.
A Vic as well. Or maybe more than one, but they've been good, careful owners.
Let me talk about that then, because when we look at business owners, what role does the company that's planning to buy a company look into the actual owners themselves and their history and their experience and everything relating to them?
Yeah. Normally a key determinant for the transaction, but multiple answers that can come from that. So sometimes it isn't that the seller wants to sell outright. They might actually want someone to come in to support growth with a view that in, say, 3, 5, 7 years, they will then exit, but they don't want to exit right now. They want to bring in a partner that they can work with, that can help them scale in the way that they need to, and then partner together. That then makes it a smoother exit because they both know each other. Yeah, they've worked together for a period of time. If it's not that relationship and the buyer actually wants to take control, they'll probably, a couple of things. They'll ask the incumbent to stay on because ultimately they are the business in an owner-managed situation. Stay on to help with transition, to keep client accounts, to ultimately help run the business in the way that it has been. And that's something generally up to 3 years, that kind of process. And normally as part of the transaction structure, they look at what's called an earnout. So that means part of the purchase price will not be paid up front. It will be paid over time. And that time will often be dependent upon performance. And that's an area that not all owners necessarily understand. They think they can realize everything on day one. It's very, very rare that you realize full value on day one. You have to earn it over time.
So let's say you've got a company that's valued, I don't know, we'll keep it very simple, $1 million. You are going to sell that company. The buyer wants to have an earn-out period. So they give you what, 30%, 50% up front? What would it be normally?
So there's no one answer to that. I'll give you a percentage, then I'm sure a viewer's going to say, no, that's not right. I got more than that. Yeah. But if you get 70% up front, I'd say you've done pretty well.
Okay, so we'll just take that back and go 50% then.
Uh-huh.
So 50% you get up front, and then 50% is paid to you in an earn-out period. And that period is how long typically?
Typically no more than 3 years.
Okay, no more than 3 years.
Yeah.
That sounds like quite a long time, those 3 years.
It is, yeah.
And in those 3 years, that person buying that business, do they assume all of the dividends that business is making anyway, or do they get part of the dividends and that kind of through that transition period, the owner still keeps some of the dividend? How does that kind of side of
Depends what the deal structure was. So if it's not a full purchase and the owner's still a shareholder, then they're entitled to dividends in the same way that the purchaser is.
But if the owner's selling the business and he's only getting half of the money up front and he wants to sell it outright and he's got a 3-year earn-out period, what then happens to the dividend if only half of it's been paid for up the front?
Well, the answer is depends what they put in the sale and purchase agreement. So it depends what contractual arrangement they've agreed. But ultimately, dividends follow shareholder. So you'd expect it to flow to the purchaser. But it might be as part of that consideration, that earnout, they agree some split on dividends as part of the earnout process.
Okay. And so if that earnout process is 3 years, who assumes the control of running that business over the 3 years? Is it the owner typically or the new buyer?
No, the new buyer. So ultimately the owner will work for the new buyer in whatever role that they've determined that the owner has. It could be continuing to run the business. It could be a board role. It could be an advisory role. Depends on what they need and what they agree. But
Okay.
they have control. They bought the shares.
Oh, so they've bought that business. They've bought the business in total. They've paid for some of it. They're paying for the rest of it in installments, and essentially.
Essentially saying that there is uncertainty around the purchase price, and therefore we want to see what future performance looks like before that purchase price is final, which is why we'll give you a piece up front and then a piece that gets determined over a period of time.
Based upon the business continuing to run and perform at the level it was at on the date of purchase, yeah? So,
because they're making their buying decision based upon what they think the business will earn in the future and what the incumbent are telling them what future performance looks like. So there's uncertainty attached to that.
everyone has ideas about the value of their business. You know, I'm sure that you've heard this a lot. Whenever I feel, my business is worth what, $100 million, you know, or whatever it may be. And just let's give some context here before we go any further. What is your background, your professional background that enables you to be able to answer these questions?
So I had a long career with one of the big four firms, almost 30 years, worked around the world, advising clients, different sectors, different industries, on a range of different things, but principally transaction-based. So being in and seeing different types of transactions and transaction structures and deals that have been put together. I am not an expert valuer, though, if that's the next question, but I understand valuation principles. But I'm not going to get my gold out. But it's probably important to say that there's a team of us. There's 9 partners in our business, and we all have different capabilities. And one of those is very good at valuation, so he tends to do the work. But let's touch on valuations. Happy to answer.
Okay, so your background is 30 years at one of the big four accountancy and auditing firms.
Yeah, and advisory.
And you've seen a small transaction all the way through to a multi-million-dollar blue chip transaction as well, from a private company to a PLC and everything in between, correct?
Yeah, and listings, IPOs as well.
Okay, listings and IPOs. So you've been part of this world for 30 years, which means you've seen almost everything that's out there.
There are still things that crop up, but generally...
Surprise you into this day. All right,
yeah.
So let's go back into this idea about valuation. So I come to you with the business and you say to me, so what do you think your business is worth? And I say, my business is worth $100 million. And you go, okay, that's interesting. The first thing that you've got to do is to establish what the value is. So what is it that you do or what are the steps you take to value a business?
Sure. It's probably important to make it clear that valuation is subjective. It's ultimately what two parties are prepared to transact at. Yeah. And that value delta, discrepancy, variation, whatever you want to call it, is perhaps one of the biggest inhibitors to transactions being successful. So what we try to do, we tend to work with what we call sell side. So the person that wants to sell their business as opposed to the buy side. And we will work with the seller to as much as we can, give them a view as to what a realistic expectation is for the purchase price. Rather than, without doing that, being told what value is from the buyer and having no perspective themselves, and also having a perspective of value that perhaps is overinflated, as you say. And the reason that we feel that's important is because if you don't bridge that gap that will be inevitable, you don't have a transaction. And if you've got two people who want a transaction, it's in their interest to make it happen. So try and deal with some of these expectation gaps from the beginning. So that's an important point to make clear. But ultimately, it is subjective, and two parties need to agree. How you get to that subjective answer is more of a science. So there is science behind valuation methodology, and ultimately that's performance based. And there's generally various data points. So most standard ways to say, for most businesses, they generate profits into the future. So what is that profitability, and what is it worth today? So you look at future forecasts, you then discount them back to present value, and you come up with roughly what is that value, and then make some adjustments around what interest rate do I use? Do I make a discount because it's a illiquid private stock? Those types of considerations. But ultimately, this is what we think. Based on profitability and cash flow, this is what you're worth. Let's now try and benchmark that. So how do we benchmark to other things? Well, there may have been transactions in the sector, where there's been a price paid, and therefore you can work out what a comparable market transaction is. Not always, because a lot of deals are private and unknown, but sometimes you can get that type of information. You might have companies that are also listed that are in the same sector and quite comparable, and therefore they have a listed share price, and you can make some comparisons on that basis. And then similarly, you can make comparisons around what's a sensible revenue multiple, what's a sensible EBITDA multiple, to try and come up with some data points that ultimately validate your DCF approach. So that tends to be the way that valuers look at valuing businesses. And hopefully, hold on. Discounted cash flow. Sorry, that's jargon. I appreciate that. What is the current value of the cash flows this business will generate in the future?
Okay. I hear this term EBITDA. What does EBITDA mean?
Cash flow profit is an easy way to describe that. So in accounting terms, there's a lot of charges you put against revenue to get to net profit, not all of which are cash. So an example of that would be depreciation of assets. So if you're an asset-intensive business, you have big depreciation charges in your income statement. But if you're buying a business, you're essentially looking to trend out things for your capital structure, equity versus debt, the type of business you are. So if you're capital intensive, to come up with what does this business generate on a cash flow basis year after year. So the generally accepted principle is if you take revenue, take your net profit, and add back those things that are not cash charges to your business, like depreciation, interest, which is a financing charge. Ultimately, what does that business kick off? And then people will use that as a basis for valuation. EBITDA is a common basis for valuation.
Okay. And is the model the same no matter what industry you're dealing with, or are there certain sectors where that kind of goes out the window? Because an example that we would have all known would have been an Uber or an Airbnb, and seeing these incredible valuations on these businesses that hadn't actually turned a profit. So are different industries seen in different ways?
Yes, in simple terms, particularly tech, which is more revenue multiple based typically. And startup businesses that are also very, very difficult to value. So what I described tends to be more appropriate for a business that's got an operating history and operating profit, less so if it's a startup without that. And therefore that becomes more subjective. And that's probably the point where I say, and I don't have the depth of detail to be able to say exactly how you do that for those industries, but you do have to flex it because they don't have the basics that I've just described. Yeah. And it does become more subjective.
You also see companies that are trying to raise capital on their Series A and Series B, and they put valuations on businesses. And I look at it and I'm like, well, how do you get to that valuation based upon the value today? Because actually the value today isn't anywhere near what the valuation is that you're putting in there for fundraising. And you go and watch Dragon's Den or Shark Tank and stuff, and you'll see this paper. Yeah, I want to raise $100,000 for 10% of my business, and the guys look at them and that's $1 million. Yep, it's $1 million. And it's like, well, is your company worth $1 million today? And it's like, yeah, no, but our projections over the next 36 months mean it's going to be. And the guys are like, well, we don't care what it's going to be. We care about what it is today because you're asking us to invest the money today. Does that make sense to you? You probably watch some of these shows yourself.
I do. And it's a perfect example of value perception and buyer and seller. And in that situation where you've got somebody who wants to raise money in front of 5 dragons who are very good at investing and very experienced investing, it kind of favors them. Yeah. So they can be more aggressive with the individual who's doesn't have the same strength, right? And that's why the negotiation point around what is value becomes harder, should we say? They're in more of a position of strength.
But that person that has put that valuation on the business to raise that capital, they've got it from somewhere, and it's 9 times out of 10 what it's going to be worth in the future. And this is the thing that I find fascinating. Yeah. It's like, why are you trying to raise money on a future valuation when you want that money today? Yeah, I'd understand it if you're trying to raise money in 2 years' time at a valuation in 2 years' time, but you're trying to raise money today at a value today. Yes, I couldn't buy a classic car from you that you said, Spencer's going to keep going up in value. Okay, so give me the value in 2 years' time, please. I'd be nuts.
Yeah, but ultimately it is still a negotiation. So what the seller's trying to say is, with the right level of capital, this business will grow exponentially. But of course, it's not there at the moment. So how much of future value are you prepared to pay for now? And the seller wants to maximize that, and the buyer wants to minimize that. And that's why it gets back to being a negotiation. What the seller will do is to say, there's no way that I can understand what value is now, but there's no way that I want to give all that away right now. I want to take some of that future profit and value right now, today. And hence it's back to the negotiation point. And a buyer will try to do the opposite.
Okay, let's come back to real life and a real scenario, business that you've got. You have somebody that comes to you and they I don't know what it's worth. Can you find out what it's worth? And you go through a process of doing that. And they're like, we really want to sell, and you engage them and you agree whatever terms you agree to help them sell their business.
Yep.
When you start doing due diligence, what kind of red flags do you see that are concerns for you when you look at businesses that make you step back and go, well, hold on a minute here?
For the sale process?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll go back to profitability.
Yeah. So profit seems to be resonating.
Profit, absolutely. You could still sell a business that is loss-making, but you're not going to maximize the potential for the seller. Yeah. So are there some things that you can do to rectify that in, say, 6 to 12 month period, and then revisit the process? So that's a big red flag. Also, if you're looking at, as I've said, typically in most scenarios, the owners, the people who are running it, will stay in the business for a period of time. If they are wanting to exit immediately, that's a bit of a red flag in terms of the deal being successful. Yeah. It's unlikely that the buyer would want them to exit immediately, regardless of what reasoning or rationale that they put behind that. They'd want them to stay in for a period of time. So that's a red flag. And then other things might be around, how well run has it been? What governance does it have? Are we comfortable that the assets and the profit are secure and they've got proper policies around things, procedures around things? And it's been operating effectively. Yeah.
Okay. Understood. You get into business with a lot of these people, and you're meeting these different characters from different parts of the world. Here in the Middle East, obviously, there's many different nationalities. Culturally, do the Arabs look at it different to the Brits? Do the Chinese look at this kind of stuff different to the Arabs? Is there culturally a lot of differences, or actually is it fairly similar no matter what?
There are cultural differences, but ultimately the end game is the same. It's a question of how do you get to the end game, and different cultures will do it in different ways. Again, some will have perhaps more, how do I say this nicely, overinflated view of what value might be, and therefore being able to manage that expectation around value definitely does vary by cultures. Some are more aggressive in terms of timeline and being realistic about what a timeline would be. So yeah, there are various factors. Culture does come into it 100%. And as the advisor, you've got to kind of just accept that will be part of the process and deal with the culture you're presented with.
Talk to me about governance. Because when we look at lots of businesses, this is a term that's used, but I'm not sure everybody really understands what it is. And a lot of people that have started their own business and built them up to be successful will have their own ways, of doing things within their business that would be perfectly normal to them. Nothing unusual about it because they've been doing it for a decade or whatever that period of time is. Talk to me about how governance applies in business and how you should take that really seriously.
Yeah, and there's no one answer to governance. It's ultimately about how well is an organization run, but run for who? And that's a key question.
Oh, yeah.
Run for who? So if you are an owner-manager, you are the only stakeholder, you are the only shareholder, then ultimately you put a governance structure in that works for you. You're not mandated to do anything. You're not required by rules and regulations to do anything. But as a responsible business owner, you want to make sure that you have a smooth operating business. So governance to you could mean quite simply a sounding board that you use, a third-party sounding board. You make sure that you've got control processes in the organization so that you're not at risk of losing assets or losing money, but you keep it quite simple. But governance changes. So that's what I would say is a maybe like entry level or a starting point. But as your stakeholder base changes, then the expectation on you to make sure that governance structures are stronger and improved becomes higher. So the most extreme example of that would be a listed company, where you have many shareholders as stakeholders, but you also have suppliers, customers, the media, analysts. You have all kinds of stakeholders. And that's why governance becomes mandated. So in listing regimes, they will say you need to do X, Y, and Z. You need to follow these rules. And governance structures they would put in place, things like a board of directors, delegation of authority, particular control and process structures that you need to put in place. And then there's anything in between. So if you're looking at, again, if I go back to the scenario we now work with, the owner manager, if they're bringing in a strategic partner, they're bringing in some investors, that investor, that strategic partner will want to know that there's governance in place. And that could then, the seller therefore saying, look, I have a board of directors. I've got 3 people who have nothing to do with this business that I meet monthly or I meet quarterly. We go through X, Y, and Z. They challenge me. I make changes as a result of it. And that's how I ensure that our business is well governed and well controlled. That's an example of that. It could be broader than that, could be bigger than that. But again, there's no one answer. It's just the more stakeholders you have, and I differentiate stakeholders to shareholders, the stronger your governance structure should be for your own benefit.
What is the difference between governance and compliance?
Governance is ultimately how, again, if I go back to the owner manager, how you want to make sure that your business is properly controlled. Yeah, that's your decision. Compliance tends to be a decision that you have to follow, but it's outside of your control. So an example is that if you're subject to a regulatory regime, say in Dubai terms, you are registered in the DIFC, you have to follow the DFSA rules that are relevant to you, your organization, and therefore you have to follow the compliance regime they ask you to follow, whether that is the type of people you have in the business, the reports you have to issue and the timeliness of those reports, those types of things. So that's where you are required or mandated to do things for compliance purposes, whereas governance is more around, if I'm using the owner manager as an example, what you want to do to make sure you control your business properly.
Okay, got it.
Clear?
Yep, I'm learning along the way. I hear this term transaction ready. Okay, the business is transaction ready. What does that mean? And is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, if you're ready, I would hope it's a good thing. Yeah, by definition. I suppose it's the point we made earlier. If you, whatever the transaction is, whether you're looking to, well, let's put it in a sales context. So you are wanting to sell your business. Yeah. What are the things that you want to do to make sure that that process works properly? And when I say works properly, it means you're going to get interested buyers. You're going to have a timeline for the transaction that is sensible and meets your requirements. It's going to be a purchase price that broadly is in the range that you want it to be. And it is with buyers that you want to sell to, particularly in the scenario where I said you're going to be tied in for a period of time. You don't want to be tied in for a period of time with people you don't like or that you can't work with. So transaction readiness is quite simply making sure you've addressed those potential issues before they become potential issues. And then whatever else in the business needs to be sorted out first. But making sure that those, if you like, tick box things that could be a problem for the transaction are not.
Okay, understood. When we look at sectors that are interesting for you and in your business, we understand the kind of the ones that are rapidly growing at the moment. What sectors are out there that are kind of sexy at the moment and are on the rise and kind of on your radar more than others right now?
I would say anything that's tech. Yeah, and I include in that tech enabled. So they don't necessarily have to be all tech businesses, but businesses that have adapted and adopted technology into their practices so that they are they operate as effectively and efficiently as.
So do you mean like a cardboard box manufacturer that's using robots to make its cardboard boxes? Is that what you mean? Is that
it could well be that, and therefore in its sector it stands out against the crowd. Yeah, it's got something different to offer because it's adopted technology in the best way that it can.
Okay, so not just a tech business or a fintech business or stuff like that. It's a business that's looked at themselves and said, right, how do we become more technologically advanced and so that we can be more efficient or better or whatever it may be?
And disruptive. So they've disrupted their sector. It doesn't mean they're necessarily a tech business, but they've used it to disrupt their sector.
Interesting.
But having said that, pure tech businesses are obviously very en vogue.
Then they're ripe for acquisition, those types of businesses?
Yeah, it varies. I mean, some startups that are very disruptive become attractive to bigger interested parties perhaps earlier than in a standard business. They can see the potential for it, and rather it growing into something that becomes an expensive purchase down the line, they take a view or take a punt and say, we'll take that out of the market now. So you can see early stage consolidation or acquisition, definitely.
Got it. Understood. Okay. This whole health and wellness space seems to have boomed over the last few years and so many different areas. We see it in businesses now taking a real interest in the well-being of their employees, and there are companies coming in to try and build wearable tech and stuff like that. Is that an exciting area in business nowadays, or is it something that's just amongst many other things and there are other things like AI that are more exciting?
Degree of excitement. I'm not sure I know the answer.
Yeah, never seen you excited.
I mean, I'm very pleased that from a workplace perspective that these things are now taken seriously, and that includes mental health and awareness around mental health. And yeah, I mean, I'd say any employer that takes that seriously, demonstrably takes it seriously, again, puts itself out there from the rest of the crowd. I would certainly say that employees of today, the Gen Z of this world, that's an important factor for them. The work-life, it used to be called work-life balance, but it's obviously more than that now. It's what sits behind work-life balance. That's increasingly more important. So I'm pleased that it is being embraced, perhaps not everywhere, but it is being embraced, definitely.
Got it. Understood. I think about industries that are almost ripe for consolidation, and I'm going to give you my uneducated opinion on something. Okay, so you can knock it down, you can agree with me, entirely up to you, but be really honest. That's what's important for me here, and I think my audience want that transparency and honesty. So here in Dubai, there are gazillions of real estate brokers. Yes. There are individuals, there are companies, there are one-man bands through to the big organizations that are out there. They just seem to be on every street corner and every shopping parade, wherever you go, no matter what the barbecue is, whatever the golf course is, whatever the beach walk is, someone's in real estate. Now, obviously, it's a booming industry, so I get that. People are chasing after the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But I also know that it's an industry that's full of people that aren't succeeding as well. How do you look at that industry from a consolidation point of view?
That's a good question. It is quite proliferated, and I probably put developers into that category as well.
Well, I know in Dubai there's officially, what I was told anyway, was 230 developers.
Yeah.
I don't think most people would know that.
Yeah.
There is a lot, yeah.
Look at consolidation from a couple of perspectives. If you rewind the clock maybe 10, 12 years, and we still have it, there's a lot of banks in the UAE for the size of the economy.
48, yeah.
They went through a period of consolidation, not mass consolidation, but for some of the larger banks, they did consolidate. So let's say there was a regulatory recognition that needed to happen. That would be better for the consumer ultimately. The same level of regulation isn't there in the real estate market. So there's no external factor that will push consolidation. So therefore, you have to look at the players who are in the market to say, does it make sense for them to consolidate? And I would say for some of the larger players, yes, they can probably, how to describe this? They could probably get some decently priced transactions, if they look to consolidate, and that's where I think you ultimately your demand or your pull will come from. Some of the larger operators saying we can continue to scale. We've probably got as sizable as we can be organically. So now let's look at some inorganic growth where ultimately we buy a book, we buy advisors, we bring people into the business. I definitely think there's an opportunity for some of the larger players to do that, but not just larger. Some of the smaller guys could come together, if you like, as a consortium, so that they can start challenging some of the bigger players.
Okay, well, I've seen that here. So I can talk about this from a position of knowledge. So the sponsors of the podcast are Allsop and Allsop. And so they're, I think, if not the biggest, one of the biggest real estate brokers here in Dubai. Those guys are a big organization and they continue to expand. And so the way I watch them expand is they keep recruiting more and more people. And by recruiting more and more people, they expand the size of their sales team. For me, it's like, is the question, keep recruiting or just start buying books of business or buying sales teams from other companies? And if you can start picking up 10 here and 15 there and 5 there and 20 there, you can essentially acquire established salespeople rather than bringing new people in. And so I look at that as a way to expand. I've seen consolidation in terms of a cooperative or whatever you want to call it come together. Mm-hmm. So there was one called One Broker Group some years ago. Mm-hmm. And that was a bunch of guys. There was, I think, 5 or 6 of them, all super smart and really nice people. Okay, really good business guys. But they came together to form one business. And I walked into the room the first time I met them all together. And as much as I like them all as individuals, the egos in the room, for me, it was like, wow, who on earth is going to be the boss here? Because everybody arguably should have been the boss and somebody needed to be the CEO. And whoever got that job, someone's nose was going to be put out of joint. And eventually that group of business owners then went back and they did their own thing and went separate again.
Yeah.
And so when I see that, I'm like, how do they come together effectively when you've got so much, ego in the room to be able to make that kind of stuff work? I mean, how would you manage that?
It's a very good point, and it's probably a point to stress that in any purchase scenario, culture is important. Culture and personalities, and quite often, some of the big mergers that have been around the world, not getting the culture right, or not working out how to deal with culture and integration post transaction, is part of the reason they're not successful or they fail. So that's actually a very poignant example of that. And therefore, that's something that needs to be considered before the transaction is done. Does it make sense? Are those personalities just too strong to be able to work together? Or can you put something in place that works for everybody? It's a win-win situation. I do think in those collectives, when they do come together, somebody should take responsibility for running it. But it doesn't mean that they are a dictator or dogmatic. They work together as a collective, and they therefore are a collective, but they have a responsibility to lead on behalf of that collective. And I think if you work through these things in advance and focus on them and recognize that they're important to the success of the transaction, you can make it happen. If you can't do that, then you get the results that you saw.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is failure.
Yeah, but culture and personalities are really important for these types of transactions. So I suppose in reflecting on when you said, do you bring more people in or do you bring a business in? From a cultural perspective, it's probably easier to bring in an individual. It's easier to manage an individual in a new culture than it is a bunch of people. But again, if you identify the right bunch of people, it could work for you. So, yeah, but it's about being careful in that process.
Okay. And then I suppose you then have economies of scale to consider as well, don't you? I mean, when you take into consideration all of these, it's what's the cost of recruiting people currently you're doing yourself? What are the economies of scale? How can you save costs? How can the business be more profitable? Yeah, okay, understood. And so have you ever seen a situation where a buyer has agreed to buy a business, they've paid the 50% upfront like we spoke about earlier, they've agreed the kind of like we talked about 36 months as the earnout, and yet through that 36 months it's fallen apart?
I can't say I've seen much of that. I can say I've seen situations where the earnout is not earned out in full. That's quite common. So if it's 50% and a 50% earnout, the seller doesn't get the full 50%. And sometimes a buyer will use tactics to be able to manage that earnout percentage down over time.
Okay.
That's not uncommon. So the seller needs to be quite savvy to that and be ready for that. And therefore, it's important that they understand clearly and agree to the terms of the earnout.
Okay.
Yeah, including having a legal team pore all over the documents that you're signing.
Interesting.
I haven't seen too many situations where it just falls over and people walk away, but I'm sure there are those situations. But definitely managing down the earnout percentage, that's not uncommon.
Your team of people at MEAP, how many of these types of transactions do you get involved with on a yearly basis? Is it with great frequency?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's probably the most, the area we're most active in. But we're a relatively small team. So if we were to see 10, 15, 20 transactions in a year, that's good for us.
Okay, understood. And outside of this one area that we've focused on here in the conversation right now, what is another thing that you guys are experts in?
Experts, helping people.
Oh, you're doctors.
So
What other things do you do? So I'm a business owner, I come to you, I want to sell a company, fine, fair enough. I want to buy a company.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough, you can help me. But what else can you help me do? I mean, do you help companies look at their strategy? Do you help companies look at how they run their businesses and help them put them into a better condition than they were before, just so they can go forward more efficiently?
All of the above.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the ethos of the business is to say an owner manager is very good at what they do. Yeah. But they're not necessarily very good at what they don't do. So what are the things that they don't do? And we've talked about sale of a business, but generally if there's stress that comes into the business or situations that they haven't seen before or transformation that's required, that's when we can add value to the owner to be able to support them with that. So it could be, as you said, strategic growth. We do see many situations where owners have done incredibly well for, let's say, 3 to 4 years, scale very quickly. Then they feel they've plateaued and they're not quite sure how then to get to the next level, what to do that. So what strategy you need to put together, what sales and marketing plan needs to sit behind it, what operating model do we need, thinking through those things with the owner is an area we do. Transformation, we've had examples where, again, clients have scaled really well. They've done it incredibly well from a revenue perspective, but they don't have the experience internally to be able to keep operations up to speed, and operations have lagged. So what do we need to do to make sure that the operations continue to support the business so that the owner can do what he or she's very good at, which is growing it, and somebody takes care of the operations to cover it. So yeah, various things, but ultimately it's working with the owner to say, where are your pain points? Where are the areas that you personally don't have enough experience in? And if you don't have experience in the team, that's where we can support you.
It's good to know there are people out there like your organization that can pick up these pieces for business owners, because you're right. I mean, I'm a business owner and I look at myself and I'm like, I don't know an awful lot about most things. And then, so how do I recruit somebody into the business when I don't know what I'm looking for?
Yes.
You know, if I was going to recruit a new, financial director or something, how would I know how to choose a really good one? I suppose this area of expertise is something I contract in to give me the advice that I need to make the decisions. Do you do mentoring as well?
Not a lot of. It depends how you describe mentoring. We're not trained coaches.
No.
But we would do board advisory roles, which I would see as a form of mentoring. So that's a more light touch service that we provide, where we might sit with the owners on a quarterly basis and just for a 3-4 hour period, challenge, prod, poke, say, what about this, whatever it happens to be. So that form of mentoring we do, yes. CEO coaching, I wouldn't say we have the skills and experience for that, but yeah.
Oh, but that's
board advisory.
Another thing though, because there's lots of guys that are out, a lady or a man might own a business and they don't have a board.
Yeah.
Okay, they don't have those experts on there to be able to question their decisions, because that's the thing, isn't it? If you've got nobody questioning your decision because everyone's an employee and they say yes sir and do what they're told, you've got no one pushing back and challenging you as to whether you're making the best decision on behalf of the business.
That's right.
So having people around
that's the unconscious bias of the owner. Absolutely. You'll believe that your decision making is right, and it doesn't mean it's wrong, but the sounding board will give you a view on that.
Tell me what your typical client looks like. Just give me an example of a typical client that you would have, because I want people out there that are listening and watching this right now to be able to identify whether they could be a kind of client that you would work with.
Yeah, somebody who owns their business, doesn't matter what stage of life cycle it is ambitious, wants to continue to grow, wants to continue to expand, maybe diversify, and therefore is constantly experiencing change in their business. And we will help manage that change in whatever form it is, including, as we've said, selling it or buying another business, whatever it happens to be.
So if anybody right now is listening to this that is considering selling their business, okay, they can come to you, have a conversation with you, and you can advise them. Anyone that's looking to expand dramatically their business through consolidation of other companies, strategic growth, they should come and talk to you. Anybody that's out there that has a business that isn't sure whether there's the right kind of governance and compliance in place, that would like to get that double check, they can come to you.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what you do. Okay, excellent stuff. It's one of those
manage change.
It's one of those services, I think, that people don't always know that's there. And because they don't always know it's there, that's why they end up in a place where they don't know how to sell their business, or they don't know how to acquire other businesses.
Yeah.
And they'll go and see their lawyer, and the lawyer will be sitting down talking to them, and the lawyer 9 times out of 10 probably isn't the right place to be able to advise them.
Yeah.
And so this is what you do. Okay, good. Understood.
And our approach with clients is not to say we do this, this, and this, because this, and this, and that might not be relevant to them. So it's a question of just sitting down with them for an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is, listening, understanding, seeing where they are in their life cycle, and then being able to say things like, have you thought of this? Or have you done that? And I'd say 9 out of 10 times, clients are receptive to that. People are receptive to that. People who own their businesses fundamentally want the best for their business. So there are very few client examples I can think of where the owner said, don't worry, I've got it covered. I know everything. Yeah, it's not usually the case. So, yeah.
Really insightful stuff there, Steve. Thank you so much for coming to join us on the show today. It's really given me a much better understanding of what you guys do, how you do it, and the difference people like you can make to business owners just like me.
Excellent. Thanks. I enjoyed that. Thanks for inviting me.